Hey, what's up, guys? Trying to finish the thing I started a while ago, the Confederate Navy, the series here from Osprey Publishing, the new Vanguard, by these two Scottish guys, Angus, Konstam, and Tony Bryan. I had gone over the ironclads. I was familiar with them, of course, the Merrimack or the Virginia, whatever you want to call it. And I was familiar, of course, with the Hunley and the submarines and the torpedo boats, which I haven't gone over yet. But the Confederate, the blockade runners, I had knew nothing about, and that was a fascinating look. And the other thing I didn't know anything about were the Commerce Raiders, right? Confederate Raider. Uh, Literally, you see the junction point between the steamship, right, and the sail ship. The Going back always to Stephen Mallory, right? The guy who says, "Okay, you are the head of the Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory, right? What are you gonna do defending the long coastline from a much larger? Pretty much the Navy is all, the North, right? What are you gonna do to defend, right?" So he had a three-pronged strategy. I like how they plays it. You produce ironclad ships with almost no industrial capacity, but the ironclads they produced did have an effect. Right? The second, you organize the defense, right? The ports. You had bases. Of course, you had mines, then known as torpedoes, right? When you think of mines floating in the water, explosives. And it was actually, like I said, they held off places. A lot of the ports that got taken were taken from inland, right, from land combat. But like places like Charleston and others, they held out for a while. And of course, in order to cause damage to the enemy, the only offensive option available to him was the use of commerce raiders. Okay, they had the idea where they were going to attack the maritime commerce of the North. And this was actually, for the numbers involved, actually very successful. There were never more than 10 commerce raiders. And when they started out, obviously, what does a commerce raider do, right? You think of privateering. They actually had some privateering going on, but the problem with privateering, which is to say piracy, was you take the ship and then you take the stuff from the ship, or you hijack the ship, you bring it into a port, and you obviously sell it. Well, you couldn't really do that. Very few ports were controlled by the Confederacy. Commerce raiders would just sink the damn thing with all the uh, supplies, whatever they were transporting on board, causing it a lot of damage. They literally almost single-handedly destroyed the American whaling industry. At that point, you see the whaling industry was dying on its own, but you still had whaling in Japan and Norway well into the 20th century, even I think even into today, despite all the Greenpeace protests. But they really punched above their weight. Initially, they tried to convert ships, but they had to do the same thing they did with the commerce raiders. Eventually, they had to go to England. This guy right here, they went over there, right? The strict neutrality laws, they had to work around it. Luckily, there were many Confederate sympathizers in Liverpool, right, and Scotland. Yeah, and the way they went about going around the neutrality laws, well, dealing with Union officials who went to England to try to stymie them. It's fascinating how they would have these ships built and get around the neutrality laws by not directly arming them, or they would change crews. They would move it out there, meet another ship, put weapons on it. Really, really clever, very clever. And the Union knew they were doing this, and they couldn't stop them until later in the war. Okay, as the war turned on the Confederacy, obviously, the Brits and the French were less sympathetic, but they always found ports, safe neutral ports all over. And as you can see, right, the CSS, the the steamships, it allowed them to go after the majority of the maritime commerce ships which were just wind driven. They had both. They were kind of like the nexus point, right, in between the technologies. Right? So I like how they had the business of commerce raiding, right? The Union merchant marine was decimated, right? And then once again, it's just like, it's not just the attacks on the ships. It's the threat of the attack that really does the job, right? The flight from the flag, right? Many people abandoned. They tried to register their ships in like Canada or any of the other Anglosphere nations, not the United States. Right? Of course, the profits would go to those places. Right? As a foretaste of similar campaigns involving submarines in the two world wars of the 20th century, the action of the Commerce Raiders was a salutary lesson to the world's leading maritime powers. Right? In strategic terms, these 10 ships pinned down 5 times their number of Union cruisers, who otherwise would have increased the effectiveness of the Union blockade of the southern coast. Right? And the fact that they were steam vessels, they didn't have to go on the trade winds, as they call them, right? To New England and of course to the Caribbean. They were able to go wherever they could, and they knew where their victims were going to be. Right? Of course, the amateurish response to the raider threat of the Union Navy, of course. And I like the photos here. I like this. This is one of the most famous. Raphael Semmes, right, the commanding officer of the CSS Alabama, one of the most successful commerce raiders that was throughout the war. Here they are in Cape Town, South Africa, refitting. Obviously, they went to places like Australia, all these other places. I mean, wherever the British Empire was, they were neutral. They couldn't do anything to these guys, and they many times helped them. Right. And of course, they try to avoid combat. Right, they were going after the easy to attack victims, while trying to avoid the other warships. But they were pretty well armed, as you can see. They had all kinds of, as they call it, the 110-pounder rifled pivot gun. They had a lot of firepower, not as much as a battleship, but like I said, they were made to move very quickly. This has an interesting factor too. The officers were mostly Confederates, Southern men, with some Southern, a core of Southern senior sailors. But you also had the majority of the crews were international. Right, many of them were British. Right, the guy claimed that his little floating kingdom consisted of 110 of the most reckless sailors, so the groggeries and brothels of Liverpool. Right. Others were former Confederate sailors, right? From who had been in some of the earlier commerce raiders, all the way over to Gibraltar. When they lost a ship, the guys would get another ship. Sometimes they would capture a ship and make it an auxiliary raider, or they would bide their time, right? And they gave a good thing to these guys here. You got to share the prize money, wages equivalent to equal rank and pay structures in the Royal Navy. An issue of grog, right? Rum mixed with water, twice a day, also in accordance with Royal Navy practice. And he said he wanted men who were ready to fight, right? And you see that you had many British sailors on them, but Dutch, Belgians, the Shenandoah, right? The last commerce raider to surrender. The crew included a significant percentage of Germans and other European countries. And one of the ironies of the commerce raiders was there was always at least 5 or 6 Yankees on the muster list. So you had northern guys also sailing on this, helping, right? They even recruited guys from Australia, right? The Shenandoah, the Alabama and the Shenandoah were the most famous ones. The Alabama scored the most, tonnage, as they say, destroyed. And the Shenandoah, of course, circumvented the world and its captain did not surrender until 8 months after the war was over. Right. Anyway, just going through here. I love the photos, man. You see, look at these men. These are men right here. This is from the same CSS Alabama in Cape Town. And so, and they saw the different ones. The Florida was interesting too. These guys were really clever. They knew how to use maritime law to kind of use trickery, but not to the point where they were going to get, if they got caught, they were going to get hung like pirates. Okay, you had all the law. The piracy was pretty much done by this time. It was no longer useful to the British Empire, but these guys sort of were like the last ones. And they showed, of course, the great Osprey artwork. Like I said, there's only really 10 of these things, and so you can see the sails and the steamships. Not as sleek as the blockade runners, because they need to fight a little bit. They need to sink these ships. And like I said, these guys didn't just attack a ship and kill the crew. They always would just force it to surrender, have the guys evacuate with enough stores. They knew the waterways. These guys weren't going to be in the middle of the ocean, lost to all. They were, they didn't kill. They tried not to kill anybody. The whole point was to sink and make the damn Union lose money, and have people wary of it. Okay, like I said, they decimated the whaling industry. Look at this. It's great, the great artwork. So anyway, of course, eventually the tide turns as the war doesn't go the South's way. England, Britain, of course, gets more strict with the neutrality. They're not as friendly. The guys who want to help, their hands are tied. The French also, who are interested, are starting to be like, no. So these guys are having to go further abroad, and one by one, because you have Union ships all over the world, right? Hunting these guys. So, and like I said, famed for being the last Confederate raider, the Shenandoah, was a compromised design. So eventually they couldn't even build the custom raiders anymore. They had to go back to converting stuff. Britain's strict enforced neutrality laws were getting worse, right? And so with the Shenandoah, it was interesting, right? Like I said, they decimated the whaling industry. They sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, right? And they went all the way into Melbourne, Australia. They were there for 2 months, waiting to be able to pay for the repairs. And they went and they just caught more of the New England whaling fleet. And this is always interesting. This is the last Confederate to surrender. And he didn't surrender to the Yankees. He sailed north into the sea, captured 21 whalers, destroying all but 4 of them. Although whaler captains were trying to convince him, hey, the war is over, dude, he refused to believe them. He headed south, destroyed another 16 prizes, bringing his total to 47. That's the only one second to the Alabama. Finally, on August 2nd, right, captain of a British ship showed that, they met, obviously a British ship was not an enemy to them, and so they probably met, and the guy showed him a newspaper, and the war was lost. The war had ended, and he was getting ready. He was going to raid San Francisco. They actually had one of the other raiders was thinking of going up New York Harbor and just shooting the hell out of New York City and Brooklyn on either side. That would have been awesome if he had pulled that off, but I think he might have been a little drunk and was convinced otherwise. So this guy eventually, right, he rounded Cape Horn, never got captured. He surrendered his ship to British authorities in Liverpool. So it's interesting. This dude here, this was the last Confederate to surrender, man. 8 months after the war. Good. Mad lad. Good job, mate. So that was the tale of the Commerce Raiders. Right? Of course, the original one, the Alabama, eventually its final fate was, it was in France, and the Union kind of blockaded them in. They knew they were there. Of course, the French were very, didn't like all this stuff. I think they were probably more sympathetic to the Confederacy, but eventually they knew there was no way out. They went out there and they fought this Union ship, and of course they weren't made for the combat, and they were no match for it. And after a 90-minute battle, they were sunk. Also interesting, in Brazil there was another one where the Brazilians, actually the Union broke the neutrality laws and attacked the Confederate ship, and the Brazilian Navy started to attack the Union because they broke the neutrality. I thought that was interesting. So, 32 pounds, look at all these guns. So anyway, great, interesting book, great artwork, very little known aspect of the Civil War, at least to me. I need to learn more about the Civil War. I know a lot more than the average person, but I still need to. There's so much to know about it, especially with all the propaganda now, where they're trying to like retroactively make the Civil War into like I don't know the Confederates or like another group that lost in another war, and trying to make that today as something to leverage against people. I'm talking about you, Atun Shea. So it's interesting. Interesting. History is a living thing. It's always in play. Okay, historicism. Anyway, good job, guys.